Hello and welcome to Jackson's Job. Today we're going to learn how to make traditional puff pastry. We're going to do it in a smaller portion, that way it is affordable for everyone. The first thing you're going to need is a cup of flour, and I always end up with 150 grams. I know the bag says different, but they're always talking about sifted flour, and I don't do that. So most of my recipes are written with this method in mind. So we need that 1 cup of flour, 150 grams. Then we're going to add a pinch of salt, 1/8 teaspoon. That's about 0.625 grams, or a gram is okay too. If you have salted butter, skip the salt altogether. Next, we're going to add in 1/3 cup of water, 80 milliliters. And then we're going to add in this special little ingredient, 2 teaspoons of white vinegar or lemon juice. That's 10 milliliters. The addition of vinegar or lemon juice adds an acid which helps delay the formation of gluten and also just makes it easier to stretch out your dough. You want to stir this until it comes together, and then you just want to give it a quick knead. I basically moved it around 20 to 30 times and it came together really well. You don't want to knead it too long, you just want to knead it until it's a nice smooth ball like this and it doesn't stick to your hands. It will still tear really easy if you try to pull it apart. You're not looking to form gluten here, you're just trying to get it a smooth, consistent dough. Now you want to wrap this tightly and you're going to chill it in your fridge for about 20 to 30 minutes. You're letting that gluten relax that did try to form, and it will make it so much easier to roll out in the end. While your dough is in the fridge, we're going to work on some cold butter. I'm going to use a 1/2 cup of unsalted butter, 113 grams. I'm going to cut it in half with a butter knife, and then I'm going to sandwich it between some parchment paper. And then I'm going to just tap it lightly with my rolling pin and then try to roll it out into a 5-inch square. That's about 12.7 centimeters, 13 centimeters, right under that. And it doesn't have to be precise, just try to get it as close as possible to a square. It makes it easier to develop those layers later. This took a lot longer than I actually thought it would. They always make it look so simple when you're making this, but it's kind of tedious. And my butter had been sitting out on the counter for about 20 minutes before I started. If I'd started with ice cold butter, it probably would have taken a good 5 minutes to get it patted into this square shape. Once we do have it in the squared shape, we're just going to fold over the edges of that parchment paper and pop it in the refrigerator. We want this to chill down 20 to 30 minutes as well. After 20 to 30 minutes has passed, we are going to sprinkle some flour on our work surface. I'm using probably about a teaspoon, maybe 2 teaspoons worth for reference. And then you're going to sprinkle some on top, and then you're going to coat your rolling pin a little bit. And what we want to try to do is roll this out into a rectangle roughly 3 times the length of your butter. What you are creating is an envelope for that butter to sit inside, so you want it a little bit wider than the size of the butter and 3 times longer. You can go up and down any way that you feel comfortable making this rectangle. I like to pause and stretch it out with my hands every once in a while and get it as square as I can. It's okay if it's not precise, you just want it approximate. As you're working, you may find that you need to put more flour down on the surface. That is okay here. This is the one time I'm going to tell you to use as much flour as you need to feel comfortable. If you don't use enough flour, you can actually give yourself a lot of headaches. So when you're first learning how to do this, generously flour your work surface and then just try to ease up as you learn. Take your time rolling out this dough. You don't have to be in a hurry here. While you're rolling out that dough, you might want to keep your butter in the fridge a little bit longer so it doesn't heat up too much, especially if you're working on a hot day. The one thing you do really want to keep in mind is the butter needs to stay chilled. If it doesn't stay chilled, then you're going to end up with a biscuit type dough and not puff pastry. Periodically, you can take the butter out and check it and see if it's about 3 times the length, and once you get it there, you're ready to go to the next step. We're going to put the butter in the center of the dough, and then we're going to fold it into thirds. It doesn't matter if you bring the top down first or the bottom up first. Just pick it and be consistent. So I folded it down and then I folded it up. Now I'm going to pinch in the sides just to make sure that that butter stays good. I'm going to put down some more flour, and I'm going to turn this dough 1/4 of a turn so that the seams are facing to the right. And then I'm going to just gently tap this and try to roll it into a rectangle roughly the size that I had prior. It doesn't have to be precise, I promise. Do the best you can here, but work quickly. You don't want that butter to heat up too much. Every once in a while, pick up the dough and check the back to make sure that the butter isn't seeping through the back. If you need to, add more flour to your surface. Be gentle here. Don't be too firm because you want the butter to be in a layer. You don't want it to come out of the dough. I've got it where I want it, so now I'm going to fold it into thirds. If there's excess flour, I will dust off the tops. Then we give it a quarter of a turn, and I'm going to go ahead and mark it with my fingernail or my finger so I know that I did one completed fold. This created 3 layers. What I like to do is sprinkle a little bit of flour on my saran wrap. That way, as the dough chills down, sometimes moisture develops, and this keeps it from sticking and becoming too hard to work with in the next step. And then I use a fresh piece of saran wrap and wrap it again, and we're going to chill this 20 to 30 minutes. If you noticed, I didn't tell you to do 2 folds. When you do 2 folds and you're just starting out, a lot of times you'll have a lot of problems. So I recommend you do 1 fold at a time and chill it 20 to 30 minutes at a time. Yes, it takes a lot longer, takes about twice the time, but we're not on a baking show and we're not in a hurry. Take your time and you will have the best puff pastry you can imagine, and you'll never want to go store-bought again. Okay, it's been 20 to 30 minutes. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to sprinkle a generous amount of flour onto our work surface, about a teaspoon, 2 teaspoons, whatever you feel comfortable with. We're going to unwrap our dough, and then we're going to sprinkle some flour on top of that. For the second fold, you create 9 layers, and I'll show you how that's done. Remember, you started with 3 layers, and then you turn it. You always have those folds on the right side of you, or you can do the left as long as you're consistent. And then what we're doing is we're just flattening those first 3 layers of dough. We're going to try again to make the same size rectangle that we had done prior. It doesn't have to be precise here. It's okay if it's a little bit off. And again, if you need to, sprinkle more flour as you work. You don't want this to stick to your surface. Just brush off the excess after you're done rolling it out. Take your time, don't put too much pressure. If you're having to put too much pressure, let the dough warm up just slightly. You'll notice your dough is too cold if it starts to crack on the edges. If it starts to crack on the edges, don't put pressure, try tapping the dough a little bit. And if that doesn't work, just give it a little more time to warm up. Not a lot, like 1 to 2 minutes at the most. You know that it's the right temperature when you can roll it out pretty easily without a lot of pressure. Every once in a while, again, flip over the back and check to make sure that you don't have any butter seeping through. Remember, the first layers are still there. We had 3 total layers, and now we're going to fold it into thirds again. So we're therefore tripling those layers. 3 times 3 is 9. This time you're going to mark it 2 times. The marking just helps you keep track of how many folds you've done. Fold it back up in your saran wrap, and you're going to chill it another 20 to 30 minutes. As you start to fold it, it gets more relaxed and more pliable. I like to put it on a cutting board to stabilize that dough as it chills down. Okay, we're doing a total of 6 folds here. I'm curious if you know how many layers we're going to end up with in the end. If you know, put it in the comments section below. But we're going to create the 3rd fold, which will give us 27 layers. How does that happen? Well, we still have those 9 layers we just created. We're just compressing them further. And what we're doing is we're going to triple them again because we're going to fold this dough into thirds. If you've ever seen some baking shows where they do a different type of fold where they call it a double book fold, that would make it 4 times the amount of layers you created. And there's actually a mathematical formula, and if you're interested, I'll include a link below that will explain it in much greater detail. But basically, this is 3 to the power of 3. So we are getting 3 times 3 times 3, which is 27. Again, you want to make this into a rectangle the best you can. Don't worry if it kind of splays out a little bit. Those little imperfections will work their way out. Okay, fold it down into thirds again, and then you're going to mark it 3 more times if you want with your fingernail or your finger. We're going to wrap it up yet again, and we're going to chill it yet again. I know the chilling is really frustrating, but if you don't chill it, you don't end up with all those nice layers of flakiness. Theoretically, you could take a break longer than 20 to 30 minutes, but what happens is the dough will get too chilled, and you'll just have to bring it to room temperature for about 20 minutes before you can proceed. So just keep that in mind. You don't have to do this all in one day. Do our 4th fold, which will create 81 layers because we are tripling that number 27, and 27 times 3 is 81. And we're just compressing those 27 layers down. Again, just try to roll this out the best you can into a very long rectangle, roughly the same size you started out with. Just try to be as consistent as possible and don't worry if it gets a little bit wider or a little wonky along the way. Always check periodically the bottom to make sure butter isn't splitting out on the ends. If you start feeling pretty confident in your abilities, you could try doing 2 folds in one go, but I am not able to do it still after all these years of making puff pastry. This dough starts to get really pliable, so I do highly recommend to use a flat surface to store it on, or it can get wonky shaped as it chills down. We are now on our 5th stage, and this is where it builds up rather quickly. 81 layers now becomes 243. Remember, we're taking those 81 layers and all we're doing is compressing them flatter, and then we're tripling it by doing that triple fold. It's also called the book fold if you didn't know that already. Once more, just try to make the rectangle the same size you started out with. Don't worry if it's a little bit wider or a little bit less. Remember, at this stage, this dough is very fragile, so be really generous with your flour now. If you have to brush off the excess, that's perfectly fine, but you'd rather use too much flour than to completely ruin your puff pastry just by being stingy. And what you can do is after each fold, you can brush off the flour and put it back in your container. That's what I ended up doing, and I only ended up using about a tablespoon's worth of flour anyway. Fold it down into thirds once more, and this creates you 243 layers of delicious buttered pastry. We are now going to do our 6th layer. Do you have any idea how many layers we're going to end up with? We're going to triple 243 layers for a whopping 729 layers. It's going to be beautiful at the end of this. I like to generously flour my work surface at this stage because I'm telling you, this is so delicate at this point and I don't want to make any mistakes. And because the dough is so cold, it's not going to really absorb into the puff pastry. It's just going to help that dough just slide around. Again, brush off any excess flour. If you have a pastry brush, this would be the time to use it. And now this is the really frustrating part, and you're gonna be like really mad because you think that you can use this right away. Well, sorry, you want to chill this down for a good 2 hours. Overnight is even better. That way you will ensure all those layers you build up is not gonna just seep out into your oven and be ruined. This will give you about 353 grams or 3/4 of a pound of puff pastry dough in the end, so you don't really need to make those gigantic recipes. If you want to triple this recipe, quadruple the recipe, it's perfectly fine. With the price of butter these days, I couldn't even justify it. I actually created this recipe smaller because you don't have to worry about ruining a whole pound of butter if this doesn't work out right. After this has chilled down several hours at the minimum, we're going to roll this out into a 10-inch square that's roughly 25.4 centimeters. This will give you 4 5-inch squares just under 13 centimeters to work with. Use a generous amount of flour as needed so that it skates around on your work surface and doesn't stick. If you try to roll it out and it starts to crack, let it warm up just a little bit. But don't let it warm up too much. You want to work with this while it's cold. I like to roll up and roll down and then give it a turn. Use a generous amount of flour here so it just skates on the surface. You don't want any sticking here. At the end, you can trim off the edges to make it really nice and crisp. And what I like to do with the edges that are leftovers, I like to just stack them on top of each other and then twist them like I'm doing here. And that way you can have a little extra breadstick that you could make it sweet or savory. I like to sprinkle it with brown sugar because it's really delicious. I also like to use a pizza cutter to cut the dough because it keeps it from compressing the dough like you can with a knife. Now, if you have really sharp knives and you're really good at using knives, you won't have that issue. After you have rolled it out into whatever shape you're using, I recommend you chill it down one more time. I like to cover it with the saran wrap that I used earlier and then a towel and pop it in the refrigerator and let it chill out for about 20 to 30 minutes while the oven is preheating. Here's some troubleshooting tips. If you don't seal the edges properly and you go ahead and roll it, the butter can seep through the edges like this. See how the butter has started to poke through the ends? You don't want that. If you tap the dough too hard, you can actually bust the butter through the layers. And then when you try to roll it, you just make matters worse. You want to stop rolling at this point and just fold it up and let it chill down. If you press too hard and you don't have a generously floured surface, you can actually end up busting the butter out through the back. And then if you try to roll it again, it's going to stick to your rolling pin. Don't try to roll it anymore. Flip it wrong side up and then fold it inward. You want to let this chill down really well. If you try to go ahead and roll this, it's just going to stick to your rolling pin and make a big mess, and you're going to ruin your layers. Just stop right here and fold it, and then chill it a good hour. I hope you enjoyed this recipe. Thank you for watching, and as always, happy baking.